Right, hi guys, it is Dan here, and today we are going to be talking about the Dragonbone Chair, which is the first book in Tad Williams' epic fantasy series, Memory, Sorrow and Thorn. Now, I've been meaning to read this book for like months because I found it in a charity shop for practically like no money, and I've heard that it is like kind of an underappreciated classic of the genre, which I can definitely confirm. You know, I thought this was a pretty great read overall, and I'm definitely looking forward to getting on to the next couple of books in this series. Now, we start off by being introduced to Simon, who is a kitchen boy in the royal castle with a vaguely mysterious past. So yeah, you know, sounds a bit familiar, a bit tropey perhaps. You know, you're not wrong. You know, this book is heavily and unashamedly influenced by like Tolkien, by the Legends of King Arthur, by Celtic mythology, by old school fantasy role-playing games, and probably by a bunch of other stuff that I haven't read, that I wasn't picking up on. But you've got to remember this book was written in 1988. So actually it was among the sort of books that were actually establishing these tropes as staples of the fantasy genre. And actually I think Tad Williams does a really great job with them. You know, I never mind tropes if they're done well, which in the Dragonbone Chair they definitely are. Now, the first couple of 100 pages of this book are pretty slow-paced, and Tad Williams, he uses them to introduce you to the normal life of the characters, and to get you settled into the world. You know, much the same as Tolkien does at the start of the Lord of the Rings with the Shire. And I really enjoyed this part for the development of the character relationships that Simon has with various people. You know, particularly with this guy, Dr. Morghennes, who is sort of a Merlin the Magician type figure that Simon ends up being apprenticed to. And it is also, this establishment of the normal world is also a vital first step in the hero's journey. You know, you have to have this normal life set up first. And if you don't know, the hero's journey it's like a narrative structure that was proposed by this academic Joseph Campbell in a pretty famous book that he wrote on, I guess, comparative mythology, maybe, is the term. And it puts forward this idea that every myth or legend, or maybe even just like every story in general, can be split down into into a number of stages. There's like 15 or 20 different stages that it can be split down into. Now, I'm like 100% certain that you cannot split every story down into these stages that Campbell proposes. But this structure in general, or at least parts of it, can definitely be usefully applied to certain stories. And you know, the Dragonbone Chair is for sure one of these stories that does fit the hero's journey structure. And as soon as you realise that that's what's going on here, then you sort of know what plot beats, what narrative beats this book is going to hit. And you know, some people they might object to the fact that this makes the plot perhaps a little bit predictable if you're used to that kind of story. But for me, what it does is, I don't mind it because it turns it into a retelling, basically. And I really like fresh takes on old stories, so it really worked for me. So yeah, after the normal state of affairs is set up, obviously Simon gets caught up in the main adventure of the book, and the big baddie and his plan are gradually revealed. And I think Williams does a really great job of setting the stakes really high and placing it all within the historical context of this fantasy world that he's created. And you know, seriously, the world building is really top-notch stuff in this. You know, I love it when there is a sense of history in a fantasy world, when it's got its own mythology, and Williams definitely hits that nail on the head, so that really worked for me. Williams' prose is good enough that it doesn't feel forced and it doesn't feel info dumpy at any point. Again, a lot of this is going to be, a lot of the world building elements are going to be relatively recognisable to modern fantasy readers, because we have seen them rehashed again and again and again. But you've got to remember, this is a book that was published in 1988, when these tropes, these ideas would have been a lot fresher. And the kind of familiar aspects of it are, Williams, he uses them as starting points that he builds on and he fleshes out to create some, like, what I thought, really cool sort of cultures and races. Like, for example, in this book, you got the Scythi, who are just, clearly based on Tolkien's elves, basically. But, although they do have a lot of similarities, it's these slight differences that Williams incorporates that make their motivations really, really unique and compelling. Now, I'm not going to go too much into the plot, because I don't think it's necessary, because I think if you've read an awful lot of fantasy, then you'll kind of know what I'm talking about with the hero's journey type story, so you'll have a good idea of the big plot points that are going to be involved anyway. And if you haven't read a lot of fantasy, if you're not familiar with the hero's journey, then I don't really want to spoil it for you, because it does make for a really good story. It's a story that has been repeated time and time again for a reason. And all I will say is that, the predictability of it really wasn't a problem for me. And, in fact, it felt a little bit like a game between the reader and the author, where you've got this idea of what the next narrative beat is going to be, but you still want to see what his take on it is going to be. But yeah, I will talk a little bit though about the characters and their relationships, because for me that was another big strong point. You got Simon, who's the main character, and he's a little bit annoying in kind of an endearing, naive kind of way. But I thought seeing his development into a more active, decision-making character was handled really well, and it felt like a natural sort of reaction to his experiences throughout the book. I thought his relationships with these two mentor figures that he has, Dr. Morghennes, who I've kind of mentioned already, and Binabik, who's this... He's kind of like a cross between like a dwarf and a hobbit type creature, but Williams calls them trolls anyway. But anyway, I thought those two relationships were portrayed with a lot of emotion, a lot of humour, and there's this sort of semi-grudging respect for them from Simon. And I also really enjoyed the relationship, the sort of romantic interest that he has in the Princess Miriamel, which... that was handled really naturally, and it's this kind of awkward teenage romance that felt very realistic for his age, I thought. You've got this guy, Prince Joshua as well, and he's this kind of brooding figure with a lot of regrets from his past, but there's this sense of like latent heroism that he's got. And then there's this guy Isgrimna, who is, I think I'm pronouncing that right, Isgrimna, who is kind of the epitome of like the sort of loyal, honourable, noble figure, and he's kind of like a proto Ned Stark, before Ned Stark. So yeah, anyway, overall, I thought this was a really excellent read that definitely stands the test of time. Although, as I say, it may be a little bit predictable in terms of the plot for a modern reader, because we've seen it rehashed again and again and again. I thought it was a really good example of how to do tropes well, and how to give a fresh take on an old story. And I'm really interested to see how it develops over the course of the trilogy, because although it seems like it's going to follow this predictable pattern, I'm still I think that Williams definitely is smart enough, he's an intelligent enough author that he's left room that he could play around with these tropes if he wants to, and also even if he does stick to the sort of broad brushstrokes of the hero's journey, I'm still not sure exactly where he's heading with the details, especially in the context of this world that he's created. So yeah, I mean, I would definitely recommend this book. To anyone who is into classic fantasy, I mean, honestly, I can't believe that I've waited so long to read this, and I'm really looking forward to carrying on with this trilogy and seeing where Tad Williams takes it. So yeah, there you go. The Dragonbone Chair, first book in Memory, Sorrow and Thorn by Tad Williams. If you like classic fantasy, check it out, and I will see you for my next video. Goodbye.